Good. Okay, should we get started? Bismillah, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we're continuing on with Hadith number 15 in the 40 Hadith of Imam Nawawi. Did we meet last Monday? We did? Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody remember what we talked about last Monday? About a long day. I think we were talking about what does it mean to speak in the prism of khair. We said that categorically, speech could be either khair, shar, or laghu, right? These are like three kind of buckets that our speech could fall into, either good, bad, or futile, like no benefit or detriment, laghu. And so then we said there would then be four essential modes in which the speech can manifest. It's either going to be completely khair, like good, completely shar, like evil. It could be laghu, neither beneficial or detrimental. Or fourthly, it could be a combination of what is khair and shar, like a mix of good and bad. But the idea was then 25% of the mode in which the speech can manifest is going to be qualitatively khair. And that's where the idea of being silent, has that much more of an imperative. Because there's a good chance of somebody speaking, 3 out of 4 of the buckets in which that speech can manifest has some element of either like wrong or futility to it. Do you know? We talked about khair in the frame of like self-talk and why it's important to have like a positive self-talk. Does anybody remember like what we talked about? Yeah. What else did we talk about? I'm asking because I honestly don't remember. I'm a little bit scatterbrained at the moment. I also feel like we didn't meet last week, and I don't know why. Yeah, go ahead.
We talked about when you don't know something, who will you go to ask? And we talked about going to people who know, and similarly, if you don't know something,
oh, amazing.
Able to say, I don't know.
Great. You're wonderful. Look at that. So we looked at some verses of the Quran, right? Ask the people of knowledge. We looked at وَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. So we talked about like not just the right words, but the right times to say the words. We talked about the verse لِمَا تَقُولُ مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ. Why do you say that which you don't do? But how the Quran is giving us a lot of ethics around speech, right? Do people remember this? I clearly did not remember it, but thank you to Luna for reminding me what I was saying. Amazing. So we wanted to focus today a little bit more on like the idea of what is not good and harms of the tongue. We're going to look at an excerpt from a text. Imam Ghazali talks about this a lot because the tongue is talked about a lot in our ethical tradition, our spiritual tradition. And some weeks ago, we talked about the relationship of the heart to the tongue, and how a lot of du'as that the Prophet would make, or a lot of like counsels he would make, linked the tongue and the heart together. But before we jump into some of those things, if we can have someone read the Arabic and the English of the Hadith, is Hadith number 15. Yeah.
On the authority of Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him, that the Messenger of God, peace be upon him, said, "Let him who believes in God and the last day speak good or keep silent. And let him who believes in Allah and the last day be generous to his neighbor. And let him who believes in Allah and the last day be generous to his guests."
Great. Jazakallah khair. Can somebody read the Arabic? Hadith number 15. Yeah, go for it.
عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم
Yep.
جاره ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم ضيفه. Thank you.
Yeah, jazakallah khair. So the latter two kind of ethics in this tradition that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, kind of doing ikram of your neighbor, ikram of the guest, like treating them well. We'll talk about those, either towards the end of tonight or next week. But we want to really hone in on this idea because so much of us is subservient to language. You build up core belief structures, positive or negative, relevant to language, how you speak, how you're spoken to. If Allah blesses you to have friendships, relationships, familial or otherwise, like language plays such a key variable. And we don't want to think about what we're going to discuss today in a way that's devoid of just reflection and contemplation, but understanding why you have so much that's written about categorically what are things that are problematic. Because even in a mode that thinks back to the self, the impact is being yielded to my heart more than anybody else, right? Like when I'm telling a lie, I hurt you, but I also hurt me. Do you see? When I'm gossiping, I'm hurting you, but I'm also hurting me. Do you know? And understanding the implications of it so that I can start to categorize and build up through it reflection that's a work in progress. So when we're looking at these things, we want to be able to identify them, build an incentive that says, well, really, like, how does this resonate with me as I'm trying to determine, are these things that make sense or don't make sense? And how much of it is kind of something that if I was to reflect on the course of my day, like I spent my time doing some of these things, do you know? Like, is this why the divine gave me the ability to express and to communicate? Does it make sense? So I'm going to read parts of the text. The one that we're looking at today is from the Ihya of Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah. And in the 4th volume, he has a section that talks about 20 harms of the tongue. We won't read every page because we're doing that with another text in the Sirah class. And we've been reading that book for like 2.5 months now. But we'll look at like the heading, maybe pick some of the hadith that get into it and have discussions on like what these mean so we can have definitions that are working definitions for us. One of the principles we want to exert in the defining of these things is that we can know what something is by knowing what it's not. Do you know? And so when you're talking, it'll help land closer to a bucket of discernment for me that says, hey, is this actually a way I could categorize this speech? Does that make sense? And so the first bucket that Imam Ghazali talks about when he's talking about these 20 harms of the tongue, the first one he talks about is unnecessary talk. And he says the best condition is to save the tongue from backbiting, falsehood, show, quarrels, disputes, etc. There are such words therein which are not beneficial and which do harm to others. If you hold useless talk, you lose time, and you shall have to render accounts for useless talks. If you are engaged in thoughts about Allah by giving up useless talk, Allah's inspiration may suddenly come in your soul. If you read tasbih, tahleel, and other invocations in lieu of useless talk, it is better for you. If a man remains busy in lawful things after giving up dhikr of Allah, it does not do him any benefit because even though he does not commit any sin, he is in loss as he loses the merits of God's remembrance. The silence of a believer is good thought. The sight of a believer is a sermon, and the talks of a believer are nothing but remembrance of Allah. This is the basis of a man's wealth. When he spends his words without necessity and does not acquire virtues for the next world, B spoils the basis of wealth. The adornment of Islam of a man is to give up what does not do any benefit to him. Another hadith of a more harsh nature has come in this connection. Anas radiallahu anh reports, a young man was martyred at the Battle of Uhud. We found then on his belly stones tied up. It seemed that he had tied up the stone for preventing hunger. His mother was saying, "O darling, you have entered paradise with a cheerful mind." Then the Prophet said, "Who will inform you whether he held useless talk or was miserly regarding a matter which did not do him any harm?" It means that accounts of such small matters will also be taken in the next world. The principle in relation to what is futile in our religion can be drawn from this idea, that anything that is not from the remembrance of the divine, then it is futile. Ata ibn Abi Rabah, rahimahullah, who is a tabi'i, so he comes in the generation after the companions. He sees two companions in conversation with each other, and they're identifying what lahu is and is not. And they say 4 things are not considered to be futile. One, they say, like spending time with one's family. 2, they say running between 2 lines. 3, taking care of one's steed, one's mount. And 4, swimming, right? So 2 of these things are about physical wellness. One is about maintaining bonds of kinship, and a third is about taking care of your belongings and your possessions. Do you know? It's not a waste of time if you come into this room and you help clean it up. Nor is it a waste of time that you take care of the things that you've been given in your life that are meaningful. You want to spend time with your loved ones, right? But understanding the paradigm shift, like I could go and sit with my mother, who is an old brown woman, do you know? And she's going to be watching on TV till like late hours of the night, like things that she enjoys watching. And my intentionality in sitting with her can be one that like hammers religion in a problematic way. Why are you watching this stuff? What's the point of it? Or understanding in that is an opportunity for our hearts to get connected. Do you see what I mean? Like a recognition that we can spend time with each other and we're not just doing things that are quote unquote sacred all the time. Like the expectation isn't that at every interaction, you're only just like reading Quran together. Do you know? But they're saying specifically, these are not things that have futility to them. And what is futility rendered in like the absence of benefit and the presence as well as like the absence, like there's just no point to it. It counters what is the fundamental goal of Sharia, which is the increase of benefit and the reduction of detriment. So it's just pointless, unnecessary talk, like futile talk that's just for the sake of talking. Like there's no substance to it. There's no point to it. And when he says that the silence of a believer is good thought, the sight of a believer is a sermon, and the talks of a believer are nothing but remembrance of God. The interjection now of this is not just about like regurgitated rote invocations. Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar. But if I'm bringing consciousness into what it is that I'm doing, rooted in a consciousness of the divine, how could I have a mindfulness of Allah and remember Allah and like slap my kid? Right? How? How could you, in the name of Allah, like speak poorly about somebody? Do you know? How could you, in the name of Allah, gossip or be racist or be arrogant? Do you see what I mean? And the default setting that is rendered through unconscious modes of communication and exertion. Like I'm just not thinking about what I'm saying. So when you try to identify what is futility, it's usually just the words are coming out. The words are coming out. I'm not even thinking about it. Maybe in retrospect, I'm able to be like, I didn't really know what I was saying. I'm sorry, right? But that's what we're trying to problem solve for here, right? What creates the environment or the situation where I'm not present in the words, but the words are still flowing nonetheless? Do you know? And what he's saying is accountability is still there. You're putting these down, right? Inna alaykum lahafidhin kiraman katibin. That upon you there are 2 preservers, writing and elevated. Do you know? The angels on your shoulder. Every word is being written down. Do I have to have a paranoia to it? No, like Islam as a religion is not a religion that is about anything other than reality. Like the Prophet laughed with his companions. He like joked around. He like did certain things that are just very human things that we need to do. You're not supposed to be like stern, somber, sulking people all the time. But it's a thinking person's religion. And it's not like difficult to make the connection that the absence of presence usually yields talk that is just like, what's the point of it? Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? So just so we can kind of get talking and get people going, more people have trickled in the room. Can we have people move up? Because people are going to come in to pray Isha, and we don't want to block their ways. So if some of the sisters can move up closer here so that people who are coming through the doorway have a way to get in to pray for the guys. Also, there's chairs that are open here in the front. So what I'd like for you to talk about is like, why does Imam Ghazali start with unnecessary talk? He could have started with anything. Do you know? He could have said the most important thing, don't like claim Allah said something that he didn't. Don't speak on behalf of the messenger. He could have named any single thing. He started with unnecessary talk as the first bucket in these 20 harms of the tongue. Why do we think that's the case, right? Imam Ghazali is like incredible in just his contributions, but also the life that he lives, what he gives up in exchange for finding meaning. Do you know? And when you read a lot of these texts, they're not just like things put together at random. When we talked about the Book of Assistance, right? Imam al-Haddad, rahimahullah, he starts with yaqeen as the first chapter. Why? Why does he start with certitude? It's giving you a destination point. Everybody is going to have different beginnings, but they want to work towards like a common conclusion, which is like deep, certain faith, right? May Allah make us people of yaqeen. Why is Imam Ghazali starting with unnecessary talk as this first box that he could have talked about anything? Turn to the person next to you, like exchange names if you don't know the person's name. Why do you think he's starting with this out of anything? And then let's come back and discuss. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, not right now. Yeah, for me it's like human nature. You don't have to. It's like don't have active presence. Evolve towards and also I just like stopped using that part. Stop. You want to get past it.
Which is interesting because I feel like we're being in a time where but like, just thinking about that. Is it? I don't know. I try not to. Is it because of the whole like conversation? I realize that I just can never be in the silence. I guess it's and you realize that like the TV's on up because you're watching it, silence that
A few years ago, I had this problem where every time I was in my apartment, I had to like put my AirPods in. Right. One day, like, I got it. And I was just felt so right? I mean, it's crazy to say now.
yeah, it's true.
But I have to go with but it's also contrary to like, the message that we I'm also on the podcast. I'm also so yeah, this is it's nice to hear that.
Yeah, when you think the prevalence of like oversaturation of podcasts, just like how it relates to video music, more opportunity to see left recently. Maybe 2016. Yeah, like 2016. I think the other thing that you mentioned. I think he was mentioning he's saying physical activity. It's funny to look at that part because you would think sitting relative watching it on TV, this is like even though audio.
Okay, what are some of the things we're talking about? Why do we think the sheikh starts with like unnecessary talk as the first bucket? What do we discuss? All right, he could talk about anything. Why does he talk about this as the first starting point? Yeah.
It's because the easiest thing for people to talk, it's harder to talk about something productive. When you just like talk, it's usually futile to categorize it.
Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Maybe it's just like a general way of changing like habits to stop something or do something new.
Okay. What else? Yeah.
So we talked about why he put this as the first one, because this like unnecessary talk is something that people keep doing without realizing that they're doing it, so they don't take it seriously, and maybe like the mom wants like to highlight that part. But then he also said that because it's also it has like the ability to form a habit of you keep doing it instead of like doing something better with the time that's been given to you for more beneficial stuff.
Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah.
One point that came up in our discussion was perhaps because you usually don't start off with bad speech, you probably tend to say something useless, and that is a slippery slope to bad speech. It doesn't go 0 to 100. It's useless is, and then something detrimental. So it's like cutting it at the source.
Can speech be haram? You can, right? I can say a lot of haram things right now. Do you know what I mean? I'm not going to. Do you know? But speech can be haram. Is useless talk in and of itself haram. Why? Huh? No, but it's important to understand, right? Is useless talk haram? The answer is no, right? It's not. So he's starting out with a grouping that isn't explicitly prohibited in the ways that when we sometimes think about like things that are not good for our hearts, we're prone to automatically go and start thinking about the things that are haram, right? Like backbiting is haram, lying is haram. Do you know what I mean? And you don't even have to like get into a place that says like this is why it's a problem. The ability for us to now tackle some of these, we'll try to talk about as we run through this today, like how do we deconstruct things that are habituated and what is it that's really coming into play when we do some of this. But when was the last time you sat down and you had a conversation and you said to yourself, this is just pointless? Do you know? And the framing of this category of identifying something is useless can now reach a conclusion that if something is useless, that means that there has to be something that's useful, right? Like language is important. If I say I'm a father, then you're going to assume that I have kids. I'm a teacher, that means I have students. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't apply to Allah in the same way, right? Allah is Al-Khaliq, not because he created something. Even if Allah did not create something, he would be Al-Khaliq. He is eternal beginninglessness in all of what we know of him, his divine attributes. And they exist simultaneously. They're not muted in different ways. But for us on a human level, the way that we can understand, like through principles of language, certain words assume like certain like conclusions. Do you see what I mean? If I'm a father, you're going to already assume that I have kids, whether you know I have kids or not. Does that make sense? Right? So if there's talk that's useless, my reflection mode can also get me to understand like what is useful. And I don't have to start with a discussion about what is haram. He's starting with like what is a challenge that permeates a lot of us. It's not that our books are going to be filled with a lot of haram. Our books are going to be filled with nothing. The angels are going to turn to us and they look at our books and they're going to ask us like, how long did you even live for? And when we engage in it, we're going to be like, maybe I just lived for a day. Do you know? You weren't given life to like exist in futility. You weren't given the ability to speak to also speak in futility. Do you see? And where Shaitan gets most of us is not going to be in evil things. There are evil people who have evil speech. May Allah protect us from ever becoming them. And you should know you have the ability to do this. But if you're mindful of like the crux of it and value every breath, even when you're not doing what's haram, but you know that this wasn't what this was given to you for, it's going to create a different paradigm around like there's pointlessness to this. How am I going to even encroach on like the things that are impermissible? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Right? Also, just think about the ways that, and we're just conjecturing here, do you know? Maybe one day, inshallah, we'll have the blessings of being in the company of the righteous in the world beyond this one. And Allah grant us this in the company of his beloved, alayhi salam, in the highest levels of his Jannah. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you start to do these things, and it creates now an opportunity to break it up a bit, where I don't have to have my back against the wall. I'm not doing anything haram if I'm engaged in futility, so to speak, but I can start to identify like what is futility in the first place if I can become embracing of the idea that likely some of my speech is there, and also don't have to work within the parameter of like initially saying like, hey, like I could go to hell for this thing, which adds a different layer of stress and anxiety to it. I'm reclaiming back a good chunk of the time that I have that's spent in pointlessness. And then I can riddle that with intentionality now that is rooted in what is positive and beneficial. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? And it's not to think about these things at levels that are like cliche or platitudinal. You don't have any control over the time that you're allocated. Like you just don't. And valuing every breath in a way that really makes like sense of this is why I was gifted this time. It wasn't so I would speak nonsense to myself or somebody else, but I'm bringing like intention to it, right? When I talk to my children, I say like all kinds of ridiculous things to them. Do you know? I say like ridiculous things to some of you sometimes. And you look at me and you're like, what are you saying? But it's a way for us to increase love between ourselves. I know a lot of you are in spaces quite often that you're not like laughing and smiling. Do you see what I mean? That intentionality at a surface level can say, well, why is this being engaged in that way? But it removes the futility when there's a sense of like consciousness to it. Does that make sense? Right? And he's going to nuance this a bit because he's going to go from what is unnecessary to what is excessive to what is unnecessary and like unlawful, do you know? And arguments and disputes that are also rooted in what is unnecessary and unlawful. But he's creating a framework for us to start trickling and nuancing. Do you see what I mean? A prism that you want to start to think about this in, right? Because you don't want to give shaitan victory over you. Allah instills within us, for our own benefit, certain parameters that enable us to just function with a little bit more ease. And habit is one of those things. Habits are not consciously acted upon, but they can be consciously constructed and consciously deconstructed. So the prism in which like habits kind of get triggered is just that. At this level, you're going to have a trigger or a catalyst. At the other end, you're going to have a reward or a craving that's being satisfied. And in the middle is the act. What most of us focus on is the act, and that makes it hard. I just don't want to smoke anymore, right? I don't want to like do this or do that anymore. But if you're not assessing, well, what's really bringing this into existence? What's the cause of it? And what is it satisfying for me when I engage in it? And being open to the idea that it's not because you're a bad person who just wants to waste time and do haram, but a lot of people turn to certain things because they're looking for alternatives to like heaviness that they're holding inside of them. Do you see what I mean? And so when you go and you say like, hey, like what becomes unnecessary and futile, like there's going to be some stuff that just has futility to it. And deconstructing that is going to be a process in and of itself. Does that make sense? Okay. Imam Ghazali gives a bunch of different examples of hadith as well as ithar, like to further the point. But then he says, useless talks are such talks which, if uttered, do not cause any benefit and do not do harm in this world and in the next. There are 3 reasons for not holding useless talks. 1, to be eager to know of which there is no necessity. 2, to enjoy talk with one with the object of loving him. And 3, to pass time with useless talks. The remedies of these 3 things are the following. The remedies are based on knowledge and action. It must be understood that death is standing in front of me, and that every word uttered will be accounted for. Every breath is a valuable asset. This is the medicine based on knowledge. The remedy based on action is to adopt silence, right? Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawm al-akhir falyakul khayran aw liyasmut. That you speak khair or you be silent. Do you know? I don't have to be the one that's always talking. You ever get uncomfortable with somebody because you don't know what they're thinking? You know what I mean? And then you just start blurting out all kinds of stuff. Do you know? Versus you ever sat with somebody and you just have such an ease and comfort in their presence that you don't really have to talk about anything. And it makes it that much more meaningful when you do talk about certain things. Do you know? But if I can just like sit with someone and be with someone and not feel agitated, and that there has to be some noise interjected, to get to a place where silence is a default, I have to be at peace with silence. Sometimes the futility is in response to the habit of not knowing how to just sit with my own self and my own thoughts. When I'm quiet and there's not a mode to let things out, I just gotta have some noise, otherwise the intrusive things are gonna settle in. Do you see? And it creates now for me a conundrum because I don't know how to just be with myself. Maybe I don't like myself. And the need for validation comes in. Like if I can make someone laugh, if I can make someone smile, if I'm engaging them in actual like conversation, like again and again, that means that I have a place of meaning in their life. Do you know? Do you get what I mean? And there's just two examples of the multitude of reasons as to why we bring ourselves to like kind of just doing things when there fundamentally isn't a point to it. You want to problem solve, like bring a point to what is pointless. And then you can assess, like, is there actual affirmed intention here that consciously I can exert in a way that habituates myself removing my things from things that bear no benefit or detriment, but I wasn't given time in the way I was to use it for this stuff. Do you know? So he says, every breath is a valuable asset. And this is where the remembrance of Allah comes in. Like even just from a pronunciation standpoint, the alif comes from the throat, the lam in Allah is a full mouth letter, and the ha is aspirated. So like in every breath, you can say Allah. Do you know? And not in a way that creates paralysis, but just as a reminder, the first part of the hadith, man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir. How is that present in the conversation that's about to ensue? Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay. When he gets to the second harm, so the first one he says, unnecessary talk. The second harm he says is excessive talk. This means to utter such words as are of no use and to hold such talks as are of no use. Necessary talks can be held in short. If one sentence is sufficient, a second sentence is unnecessary, though it has got no sin. The sage Ata ibn Abi Rabah, who we just talked about, said, your predecessors used to hate too much talking. They used to consider talks as superfluous, except talks on the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, enjoining good and forbidding evil, and necessary talks for earning livelihood. The Quran states there is careful guard of what he utters. There is no limit of superfluous talks, but there is no good in most of their secret talks, except in the talk of one who enjoins charity or good deeds to make compromise between men. The Prophet ﷺ said, his is blessed who restrains his tongue from superfluous talks and spends out of his excess wealth. Hazrat Hassan al-Basri rahimahullah said, he who talks much falsehood. The sins of one who has got enormous wealth are great. He whose conduct is bad punishes his soul. Once a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and praised him much. The Prophet said, there's nothing between them which can prevent your words. He said, nothing worse has been given to man than long talk. The sage Ibrahim said, rahimahullah, two conducts destroy a man, enormous wealth and too much talks. So excessive talk is now nuanced from useless talk, right? Like I can have purpose to what I'm saying. You have a prophet whose speech is described as jawami in nature. Do you know? You just think about it. You're sitting in a conversation with someone, they made their point, and they're still like laying into you. Do you know what I mean? And you can't say, I'm like, just shut up, man. Like we get it. But a framework of also understanding, like where it comes back to the self, we're not built to go on marathons the way we do. And marathons are not just physical in their nature. Emotional marathons, mental marathons leave us depleted and exhausted. The thought that enters in a state of exhaustion can render now excessive intrusion related to that thought that has it pile onto other thoughts because I don't know how to limit conversations with others or with myself. Do you see? How often do you sit up in the middle of the night and you can't go to sleep? Or you're in a place where you have to turn to a device because it's the only way to silence like thoughts in our heads. And there's a connection between excessiveness within a conversation internally and excessiveness that sometimes doesn't come out outwardly. But it's not that I talk too much outwardly and that's why I talk in my head too much inwardly, but I don't actually have anybody to really talk to about what I'm holding. And then it just starts to like filter and resonate into everything and weigh me down. And I get depleted. I get exhausted. Do you see what I mean? Why is this important for us to understand? Also, it's not always just about us. Do you know? People used to ask me a lot when I first started working in the job that I work in, like, who chaplains the chaplain? I didn't have anybody to talk to. I had this weird thought in my head that created that much more loneliness in my role that if I let anybody be there for me, I'm not going to be able to fully be there for them. Doesn't make any sense, right? But in being able to understand in my 20s where my physical health was like constantly shot, I was getting sick all the time, my weight fluctuated a lot, and I was running on empty for the most part, I was constantly like in my head. And the action of rumination, which is an inward speech that is just excessive kind of chewing of the same thoughts again and again and again. It's just not good. Do you know? If you find people that you can speak with, people who can carry some of what you're holding, you're entrusted to be a caregiver of somebody, right? You listen empathetically, like listen to understand, not listen to respond. It'll create opportunities for people to let out all the heaviness that they're holding in their spiritual hearts that are overflowing with things, that then like just get it all out, and then they can go back to some level of balance in speech. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm trying every which way to get you to understand that you hurt me. That's not excessive talk in the way that this is identifying. Do you get what I mean? But maybe that's not the person you should be speaking those feelings to. Do you know? It would be ideal that everybody that we want to be there for us is there for us in the ways that we would like for them to be. But sometimes they're not, and dissonance has us just keep going back to them, saying, maybe if I just said it a different way or another way. No, man, like you told them, they're just not hearing and listening. Doesn't mean you hold it inwardly. Like you got to find the people that are going to actually be able to hold it and carry it. Ours is not a religion that stigmatizes therapies in any ways or counseling in any ways, nor does it say that that is a detrimental or futile endeavor, because there's intention to it and there's benefit to it. You're not in a vacuum just revealing the sins of people, but you are in a place where there's purpose as to why you are speaking about what you're speaking, and the person you're speaking to also makes sense, right? And if you remember, we said this when we looked at the verse that says to speak to who? Like the Ahl al-Dhikr, you know, the people of knowledge within a certain discipline, because when you're asking someone, what did we say? Like you ask someone hoping to get a response or an answer, do you know? Like the person's got to make sense that you're like communicating this stuff to. Do you see what I mean? And then you have the other dangers that like, I just like hearing my own voice, do you know? So I'm going to be the only one that talks, and I'm the only one that's allowed to talk. And I'm just going to continue to put the words out there in a way that is affirming exactly what for me. Do we understand the difference between unnecessary talk and excessive talk? Yeah? What's the difference? You're nodding your head.
Unnecessary meaning it's futile. Excessive meaning that if you can say it in shorter words, it's not productive to continue speaking.
Great, right? It's simple, right? Kinda, do you know? And then so you just start thinking. We also live in a digitized world. Like communication is not just like the verbal act of speaking, but you're putting like tons of words into existence whenever you're typing and texting and messaging. And you can't think about this like in a way that's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like you actually have to understand that that's a thing. Do you know what I mean? Right? Like I don't I have a lot of people's phone numbers in my phone book. And so people text me a lot, which is fine, do you know? And I don't respond to text so well, which I apologize for, but I'm just not good at it, do you know? But I'm in like places where people will send like entire paragraphs of text messages in like minutes back and forth. You just got to make sure that it's necessary. Do you know what I mean? If it's creating the facade of healing, what's it really doing for you? Do you know? And the ease through which communication can happen now, where someone doesn't even have to sit in front of you for you to have a conversation with them. You're like inputting a lot more into your own books that have no benefit or detriment at the end of the day. And that's where the angel comes. Like, how long did you actually live? Maybe I lived just for a day. But if the crux of my day is just like engaged in a constant back and forth that habitually is just giving me a dopamine shock, you know, because I'm writing it and I'm anticipating the notification that comes back, that like the people who made these things, they know how you work better than how you know how you work. And it creates addictive aspects because you do get like a jolt of a happy chemical whenever you're getting one of these notifications. Does that make sense? So unnecessary talk, excessive talk. The third harm of the tongue, he says, this is useless talk in untrue matters, and to spend talks in actions of sins. For instance, to state the beauties of a woman, to tell about assemblies of drinking wine, to praise like the sinners, do you know? To discuss some of the forts of the rich, to narrate the oppressions of the kings and the rulers. These are all unlawful talks. To hold unnecessary talks and to talk much about necessary things should be given up, though they are not unlawful. So don't hold talk except on good of this world and the next. The Prophet ﷺ said, a man may hold such God-pleasing talk, the result of which may not be known to him, but God writes his pleasure, therefore up to the resurrection day. A man can hold such talk to displease God, of which the result may not be known to him, but his displeasure therefore may be written for him up to the resurrection day. The Prophet said, a man utters such a word which excites laughter of the people of an assembly, and he throws himself thereby to such distance as that of the pole star. He also said, the man who holds useless talks about sins for most part of the time will be a great sinner on the resurrection day. This is supported by the following verse. We used to hold useless talks with the talkers. God then revealed, don't mix with them till they hold other talks, or else you will be like them. Right? Like people can sit and just talk about haram. Do you know? It happens a lot. Like Imam Ghazali is writing not in contemporary language, and it's a translation of a primary language, do you know? But if I sit and I talk about haram, do you know what I mean? Right? And I justify it and validate it in what ways? Do you know? You're not supposed to talk about certain things that are haram. I've worked with like our community for 20 years, including people of various age backgrounds and things. Do you know what I mean? I've had the unfortunate reality of like young men who have sat in this room years ago, like sharing with other young men, like what they know of what like young women look like who at one point like did not wear like a physical head covering and now do. Like, what are you doing? Do you see what I mean? Right? And this is different from useless talk and excessive talk, because now, like, you're talking about things that fundamentally are pointless And they're rooted in matters that are either false or just like things that are haram. Do you know what I mean? And you got to think about it in that way, right? If Muggin and I are talking about Ramadan and we're like, man, Ramadan's coming, we can't go to that party in the first week of Ramadan. We got to just plan that party like the week before Ramadan starts. And we're going to have like this thing and all this other stuff. Haram, haram, haram. We're talking about haram, right? How would that be in it? We don't have those conversations, by the way. You know, nobody got uninvited to the party that Muggin and I were having. Don't feel like that was something we left you. We would definitely want you to come to our party, right? But do you understand like the nature of it? Hey man, what are you doing this weekend? Why don't we go do this? Let's go to that place and like, you know, like try to like pick up some women, God forbid. Let's go to that place and, you know, like this is what people did to the prophet. A man comes in to do business and Abu Jahl doesn't pay him, and he seeks like support from people, and the Meccans have been persecuting the prophet of God, and they want to continue to mock and ridicule him because he hasn't like said anything to them. So they talk together, how do we like make life more hellish for Muhammad? And they tell the man, go ask the prophet to go ask Muhammad, he will intervene for you, thinking it's just setting him up for more pain, right? That's not a nice conversation to have. Do you know what I mean? Do you get what I'm saying? If you're sitting down with your friend to conjure up a plan on how you can make life difficult for somebody, I'm going to go online and write these things anonymously about someone. The angels still know what you're writing. Do you know? They do. Let's make a plan about how we're going to go visit this club or this bar or these kinds of things is one category. But it's also, hey, like, let's talk about how we're going to do what? Like displace generations of people, you know, who have historically lived in neighborhoods. How we're going to make wealth off of unlawful financial products that like riba is crazy haram. Do you see what I mean? You don't want to reduce this to conversations that are about like what is the most anticipated thing, but like really get to the crux of it. If I'm like sitting with my wife and my child comes to me and talks to me about like a boy she wants to marry, my son talks to me about a girl that he wants to marry, and God forbid my wife and I sit and we start having a conversation that's racist about how our kids shouldn't marry people that come from different cultural backgrounds than our own or different skin colors, right? How is that a conversation pleasing to God? But it's like if I'm talking about my racist attitudes or my decisions around like my racist perspectives, right? This is a third potential harm of the tongue. And just because I'm talking to somebody who's going to verify it, do you know? That's not like the validator, right? Allah and his messenger are giving a sense of what's moral and ethic. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? So bucket number 3, useless talk in untrue matters and to spend talks in actions of the sins. That you're engaged in conversations that are speaking about what is impermissible or things that are just simply like falsehoods. This is also a challenge in a digital era that gives you access to information with such ease. Kadhab is somebody who lies about something. A kadhib is different from kadhab. You're a kadhib because you're only narrating when you've heard one side of a story. You're only sharing in a matter where like it's presented to you without insight. Do you see what I mean? Barring situations of abuse and oppression, you think about like how many different things you read online that are just rooted in like gossip and backbiting, the things that you delve into, like why do you have to share this? What is the point of it? And could it categorically be something that is rooted in what is impermissible? Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay, let's do this just to take like a quick pause. If you turn to the persons next to you, what are you taking away so far? We've talked about 3 of these harms so far, right? Useless talk, excessive talk, and useless talk that is now rooted in like things that are haram. The first 2 buckets, useless and excessive, like there's not a potential ground for saying like this is impermissible. But in this third bucket, we interject now something that could be impermissible potentially. Do you see what I mean? So let's talk about it a little bit and then we'll come back and discuss. What I'd like for you to talk about, what do I do with this information? Like, what's the point of me hearing it, listening to it? Like, why? Why do I have this in front of me right now? Right? Like, what am I supposed to be doing with some of this stuff? Let's talk about it and then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead.
Sorry. Hello.
I'm sorry. Yeah, like the things we're talking about right now. Like, what are you gonna do with it? Do you know what I mean? Yes, yes, sir. What can I do for you? Yes, sir. Why are you always telling me what to do? Yeah, I'll tell people. Are people buying stuff? Yeah? How'd it go? Did more people buy things? Huh? They did not? Everything got completed? Did they fix everything? Okay, I'll let people know. Yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds good. No, I'm okay. Do you need anything? Great.
You know, when they were like, you know, how do we go from just like splitting marks? And it's because of this excessive. That's so had done enough, you know. Something. So it's kind of more about a terrible process.
And after that, it feels like a slope. You know, he starts with very such excessive.
Scholarly class.
Yeah, exactly.
It's actually really interesting because Definitely not.
Okay. What are we talking about so far? What are we discussing? Maybe we can have a couple of people. Like, what do we do with this information as we get it, right? So we're not just kind of like, hearing, but I got to do something with it, right? What do we discuss? Yeah.
We kind of talk about having the goal of kind of speaking as righteously, naturally as the goal. So like kind of at first it'll be uncomfortable and have to like judge our different types of talks, different types of speeches with the different categories we spoke on. But then kind of having the goal of after a while, it's just natural and our speech is, I guess, more righteous.
Okay. Yeah. Other thoughts? What else did we discuss?
Keeping conversations short, like keeping it simple with not too much information. Who, what, when, where, why. And, some like your brother was telling me, some cultures like to talk a lot, and that invites more unnecessary talk.
Okay. Other thoughts? Like, what do we do with this? Yeah. No, or whatever you're going to say is fine.
It's just interesting how Imam Ghazali ordered it. You would think that you would order the haram talk first, but he started with the unnecessary talk, and then excessive talk, and then haram talk. So it seems like a slippery slope, almost as though like stop doing the unnecessary talk, or at least take heed to it, so that you don't go into the haram talk eventually.
Yeah. Right. I mean, most of you aren't going to like go rob a taxi after this. Do you know? But if Shaitan is not getting you to do bad, he's going to try to limit the amount of good you can do. And if your capacity to do this much good and he gets you to do this much, there's still a gain in that. Do you see? And you can only do things within the time that you have allocated to yourself. Do you know? Like, and if there's not intention or purpose to it, like it's just kind of diminishing, right? All right, let's try to read through a bunch of these quicker. The fourth harm of the tongue, he says, are quarrels and disputes which are unlawful. Some of this gets rooted in religious discourse, right? Ours is a tradition that's very remarkable in that it predicates the identifying of orthodoxy through like diverse opinions. It doesn't say like what is a contemporary phenomenon that exists, that everything just has to have the correct answer, do you know? And people struggle with this, right? Like, what is the answer on things? We do have things that have like absolute answers. God is one. That's just what Islam says, and that's what is reality. Do you see what I mean? Right? We pray 5 times a day. Do you know? But we're not in a place where like our religion was ever uncomfortable with different opinions on certain things. Do you know? Where there's room for different opinions. People today have built up these expectations in ways that are also problematic, and it can lead towards like the acquisition of knowledge that borderlines or transgresses like why one is acquiring information in the first place. Do you know? And sometimes it's really easy for the ego to have a boost, and you can be really wrong on certain things, right? Example I've given before, when I was like an undergrad, and I was 19 years old, or maybe 18 or 19. I was a writing TA at a CUNY college in Brooklyn. And it was a winter, and I had gone to pray, and I went into the bathroom and made wudu, and they had a prayer room there. And when I make wudu, like I wash my feet in its entirety. I don't just wipe over my sock. There's some people who would wipe over like a regular sock. Allah knows best, right? But I washed my foot entirely, dried my foot off, put my sock on, and then I went into the prayer room and some guy was sitting against the wall. You know, I'm not stereotyping him, but as a brown man, I could say he was a brown man. And, you know, he had like a big beard and he looked like the prayer room was like his kingdom, do you know? And some other guy came and prayed with me. And after we finished praying, the guy leaning against the wall started talking to the guy who prayed with me in Urdu, saying that I was wearing socks, which meant that I just wiped over my socks when I made wudu, which meant that my wudu didn't count. And because I led him in prayer, that his, like my prayer didn't count and his prayer didn't count. So he should repeat his prayer. And then I started talking back to him in Urdu. And I was like, I can understand every word you're saying. And not only are you wrong, like, what are you fundamentally doing? Like, you clearly are in a place where people take direction from you. And look at how you're using the knowledge base that's been given to you. This guy is likely never going to talk to me again in his life, you know, based off of the example that you're giving to him and how you illustrate me to be in his consciousness. Do you see what I mean? Let alone, like, who are you to judge the acceptance of my prayer? You weren't with me in the bathroom. How do you know what I was doing with my feet? Do you know what I mean? And he was like, I'm sorry, brother. And I was like, yeah, but like, why are you doing it? Do you know? And what's the source of his, like, kind of conversation? It's knowledge that he has, right? And when you and I argue, what are we trying to actually prove? I know better than you do. And at some level, the argument can turn into not even about what we were discussing, like, you know that you're wrong in what you're saying, and you're still fighting about it. Why? And I say it with love, like, how is that anything other than arrogance? Do you see what I mean? I'm just fighting for the sake of fighting. It's not even that you are right. I just can't be wrong. Do you know? How does that come from something prophetic? How is it not potentially coming from something shaitani? May Allah protect us from it. Do you know? And you can parallel it in religious like discourse where people like just get in each other's face. And the point of it is to say like, my way is the best. I practice Hanafi fiqh. I studied Hanafi fiqh, right? People like to say like, there's more Hanafis in the world than any other like Sunni school of thought. Do you know? It's not hard to have a lot of Hanafis when they institutionalize Hanafi like legal thought within broader empires that exist historically in the Muslim community. There was a time when hundreds of legal schools of thoughts existed post the time of the Prophet of God. And all of them were considered to be within the prism of orthodoxy. 4 remain in the prism of orthodoxy, but it's not always from like the romanticized ideals that we say that they remain. And there's people who like were the founders of these things, right? Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, whose school is the one where people will wipe over their socks, right? His students ask him about praying behind someone who doesn't redo their wudu when they have like nosebleeds. Imam Ahmad is of the opinion like when your nose bleeds, like you redo your wudu. And when they ask him, he ponders on it because they want to actually know, what do we do in this? They're not like trying to rile things up. You know what I mean? Imam Ahmad says like, you know, this is a good question. He's like, I would pray. Like, you know, what are we saying? Like, I wouldn't pray behind Sa'id ibn Musayyib, rahimahullah, or Imam Malik, rahimahullah, who are prominent Maliki figures, right? It's not the point of knowledge to weaponize it and like bring people down with it. Do you know? And it leads to like unnecessary disputes and arguments. Sometimes you gotta just smile and nod. Do you know what I mean? But then also beyond the realm of what is just religious knowledge, like, you know, people fight all the time. And the things that people argue about are so ridiculous. And the amount of time that they spend like arguing about certain things that really just are the given under the guise of like other like pains and challenges that they're holding. Do you know what I mean? And this is where like cliche phrases like hurt people come up. You could be fighting with somebody, and in reality, you're fighting with somebody else, and they're not even there. I had a friend of mine man, like I had a long day. My head was hurting. I was exhausted. I still remember because I was sitting with this person like in my apartment, and I just wanted them to shut up, you know? And they just kept talking and talking and talking. And in the middle of it, I was like, can't you just be quiet? And then I called them somebody else's name. And they were so embedded in what they were saying, they didn't hear me say that. And then I said in my own head, like, why did I just call this person someone else's name? And everything that they were pouring on me was taking me to a place where I was reliving like similar conversations that I was having with somebody who was very difficult in my life at one point in my life. Do you know? And any one of us attaches memory to emotion. May Allah grant us healing in our hearts. It's not that everything that's in our hearts is because of us, but I got to determine if I'm going to confront it in some way or not, because I can bring that up in a place that is inopportune. And I start to channel what someone else brought to me towards somebody else. This is why, like any relationship you enter into, romantic, marital, like everybody brings baggage into a relationship. The problem with marriage, right? I mean, not the problem, right? Marriage is beautiful, you know? Don't tell my wife, right? But one of the things that comes up in marriage is that you can't run away from it anymore. Back to your own space, you have to confront realities that you never really confronted before. And a lot of people end marriages in unhealthy ways, not because of what the other person is bringing in or the dynamic between the two of them. They don't know how to stand up to the revelations of themselves that they don't know how to function in relation to any longer. It might not even be because of them. I can't now not like, I can't pretend any longer that I don't have like a screwed up family dynamic, that my parents, my siblings messed up, and my spouse is saying, like, that's not normal. But I don't know how to confront it. Abusive dynamics, other dynamics, and then I just fight and fight and fight. But who am I fighting with at that time? And then there's other people, they just enjoy like always being correct. Why would you always want to be right, man? There's no growth if you're not wrong. The entire system is predicated on spiritual improvement, necessitating something to improve upon. And there's a good chance if you're the type of person who doesn't know how to say sorry or admit that they're wrong when they're clearly wrong, or just continues to fight for the sake of fighting. And if you want to know if you're argumentative, do you interrupt people a lot when they're talking? Your nuffs can't even literally tolerate the idea. You just got to speak your own words. You're definitely then listening to respond, not listening to understand. And it doesn't have to be with the masses of people. Do you know? Somebody could be really nice to someone and still be a jerk to somebody else. Do you know what I mean? That guy could be great in a public setting and it's so amazing. They serve water to like people who are fasting and they vacuum carpets and whatever else. They could still be a jerk to their kids. The two things are not mutually exclusive. Do you see? In my experiences, they're so nice and they're so kind. I don't know them to be this person. You are not like the center of every experience in the world. Do you see? But argumentativeness, like there are signs to this. And if I don't want to be argumentative, do I have the ability to just listen when somebody is telling me stuff that I don't really want to hear, but I need to hear, and Allah is speaking instruction to me, even if I don't want to hear it? Do you get what I mean? I push back and I push back because the nafs is rising up and shaitan knows where to manipulate where I'm insecure. So you don't want to engage in this, right? Quarrels and disputes that are unlawful. Sometimes you do got to raise your voice, and it's the most righteous thing to do. Sometimes it's important to get in somebody's face and argue, but it's not necessarily what's going to be the norm. Do you see? And if fighting for the sake of fighting comes up, or the arguments are being held on things that are haram, it creates a challenge. Isa alayhi salam, he says, the beauty of one, so Jesus, peace be upon him, he says, the beauty of one goes away who speaks too much falsehood, right? Like literally, like the impact of haram is visible on your face. The beauty of one goes away who speaks too much falsehood. The gentle manners of one goes away who disputes with the people. He whose thoughts are many is attacked with illness. He whose conduct is bad punishes his own soul. In making the transition between, well, yeah, it makes sense, to like, well, how do I disrupt it? You just take a day at a time, right? If you're riled up, you got a lot of wounds inside, your mode is to go into a self-defense mode. You don't know how to tolerate the idea that you make a mistake. It's going to be very hard to not argue and fight. And the majority of the time, you're just fighting with yourself. And it's going to burn bridges and create impact on how people perceive. So you take a breath. And some of these things are going to have like common solutions that are not just going to be about getting validation from your best friends or your family who in their own anxiety don't know how to really carry what you're holding, and they'll become solution oriented rather than just validating the feeling and referring to those who can help us navigate some of the pains that we hold. Do you know what I mean? At the other end of this, what you want to understand, if you argue and yell at someone and constantly put down their ideas and thoughts, you are going to hurt their feelings. There's a lot of people who think that they're smarter than their mothers. Think about if you've ever said to your mother that she doesn't get something or she doesn't understand it, and you get frustrated with her. Do you know? I'm just saying, just think about it. Sometimes it might be right? Some parents, they can be idiots, right? Allah protect us from being idiot parents. Do you know? Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, he says that the abrar are the dutiful ones. They are called this because they give bir in both directions. They understand there's bir, there's a right, a duty from the child to the parent and from the parent to the child. But you're going to replicate like what you're socialized with. I sat with a young man most recently who's sitting with me, overtly negative. And as we're dissecting and distilling it, right, it's just very clear that the thing that he's adopting is what he dislikes the most, which was the negativity of his parents that now just permeated his own psyche. If you grew up in a house where everybody spoke by yelling, why wouldn't you yell? Or if you didn't have a voice to interject because there was a lot of yelling, it's still sitting and it's going to come up in inopportune ways, right? But I still have accountability for it. If I, God forbid, grew up in a home where my parents like quarreled a lot or like argued with me or shut down my voice, I can't express that in an unhealthy mode towards my children, right? How will those two things make sense? And who has a responsibility there? And what are we going to tell like a baby? Like, well, you should be supportive of me more. They're a kid, do you know? I got to just pay attention to the signs that are coming up. So within argumentation, one of the things you can reflect on, somebody's talking to me that doesn't hold power over me, but in the balance of power, I might hold power over them. Am I actually giving them room to speak, or do I keep interrupting incessantly? Am I waiting for the moment where I can just butt in? That doesn't demonstrate I heard a word that they said. I was just looking for the room to kind of shut them down. Do you know? And that's not the sunnah of Muhammad alayhi salam. Do you see? Fifth, he says, is disputes over wealth and properties. And so understanding like the nuance of this, right? In terms of like ownership of possessions, literal like properties and things to that effect. Do you know? The idea in how Islam becomes relevant in any given community, and we read books that are written centuries ago, might not like manifest in the same ways that we would understand certain things to come up. And so I'll give you an example like that comes to mind. We have a large community. If you ever read the request for dua emails that go out, right? Like quite often there's a lot of people who have passed away. May Allah grant them peace and entrance into Jannah without any judgment. Inheritance law is like a very like specific type of fiqh in our tradition. You don't have to know it to be Muslim. You know, the way you have to know how to pray Fajr. You don't have to know inheritance law, right? But the number of people I could tell you that I've sat with in moments of inheritance that suddenly just like go at odds against one another. Because money is a big fitna, right? Land is a big fitna. A home is a big fitna. And it turns into modes where like dispute, argumentation, quarreling becomes very apparent in those modes. And it brings out like the worst in people. Do you know what I mean? This is not the same as like inequitous government usurping land or like land grabs or occupations and this kind of stuff. We're not a religion that tells people it's better for you to be quiet and to speak out against a ruler is a problem or like any version of these things. Do you see? And it's an important nuance to make because we're living right now contemporarily. We're literally like the president of this country is having conversations with the presidents of other countries to talk about how they're just going to assume ownership of other people's countries as if that's just a thing that they're entitled to do. Right? But that mindset builds itself up in certain ways. When you have minorities and people who are underserved and underprivileged that stand up for their rights, quite often they're told that they're being like a bad version of themselves. You know, you're supposed to be more loyal. You're supposed to be more this or that. Be grateful for what you have, right? This is nonsense in the ways that whiteness imposes certain things upon us. But here, there's going to be things that come up in these ways that have to do with actual materialistic possessions and these kinds of things. And then it brings out like the worst of us in communications. Do you know? Why do you deserve this from our Father, right? Like you do this, this, and that. You're still accountable for all of the words. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? The sixth thing that Imam Ghazali brings up is in terms of the harms of the tongue, are ornamentation in talks. So the Prophet ﷺ said, I and my God-fearing followers, or I and my God-fearing men amongst my followers, rather, are free from artificiality. Right? And I think it's such a beautiful hadith in describing like what does ornamentation really mean here and how it's distinct from excessiveness. He said, of all the persons amongst you, the object of the greatest wrath to me and the most distant from my assembly is he who holds useless talks, makes ornamentation in talks, and adopts artificiality. And the Prophet said, those who grow eating various delicious foods, put on various dresses, eat various delicious dishes, and talk with ornamental words are the worst amongst my followers. He said, beware those who make exaggeration in talks, they're ruined. And he said it thrice. Umar radiallahu an said that eloquence in talks, he juxtaposes like this idea of ornamentation to an ornamentation of shaitan. Like understanding this with the intentions of what exactly? Because the Prophet's words are beautiful, but he's not speaking to like fuel his own ego. Do you know? So we're not talking about like artistry and poetry, people who delve deep into giving a sense of the realities of what it is that people struggle with. Do you know what I mean? But if I get up and give a khutbah so that you can tell me I speak beautifully, like this is a problem. Do you see what I mean? And the whole idea is exactly what? Like utilizing the Jummah khutbah in a way, like I speak in a lot of different places, you know, and understanding there's a difference between somebody in the audience, my objective being to convince them that I speak well, versus that this is an opportunity for me to perhaps mold and like pass on information that can help in the betterment of somebody else's like life existence. Do you know? And the ego is very real. May Allah grant us an ego that's in a state of contentment, but in understanding like this part of ornamentation, you know, that goes into it, like, why am I beautifying this in this way? And do I want to be in a place where I'm seeking like the praises of people? You know, it's a harm of the tongue. And the artificiality comes up a lot, right? How many people you know, man, who are in relationships and the way people spoke to them in the early stages of it is so different from who they end up being? You know, you're creating like a hypocrisy when you're beautifying it. Do you see what I mean? It's like if somebody gets catfished online, do you know, right? People aren't, you know what I'm saying, right? And you're like, hey, this picture you sent me, do you don't really look like this, do you know, right? You can do that with your words. And you sit with people and you say to them all kinds of beautiful things. And then after like the wedding day, it's like, what happened to you? You know what I mean? Like, you told me you're gonna take me here and do this with me and that with me, and like all and every day you were like telling me how beautiful I am or whatever, and now all you do is criticize me, right? What happened? It's a challenge. Like, you don't want to fall into the artificiality of it. If you enter into a relationship not seeing what someone is like at their emotional worst, it's going to give you a wake-up call once that relationship gets cemented. Because love is about accepting somebody at their best and at their worst, but not making excuses for them at their worst that they should not transgress against. And when the Hadith tells us to marry for certain things, and in particular character, one of the ways that's explained is you better see what that person looks like when they get upset. And if you are built to handle that, and if they're built to handle like your upsetness, you see what I mean? It's really easy to get lost in it. I work with a lot of survivors of abuse. May Allah make it easy. How many people you know, man, they go back to their abuser because they just speak all kinds of nice things. I'm so sorry. You know, I shouldn't have done this and that. And like, what is it that's bringing them back? Ornamented words. Do you know? They are fake words. That's what an ornament is. I'm like decorating the tree to make the tree look different. I'm putting up the lights to change the way the house looks. Do you see? And people, when they make artificial their language, there's not a genuineness, a sincerity to it. The beauty of the Prophet's words were not just in how remarkable he chose every word that had such deep meaning. It's really amazing, right? If you ever study rhetoric and language and communication, it is crazy like how amazing this man speaks, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he's also sincere in every word. Do you know? He's not just saying it to solicit a response. And that's why you don't have to take it with like a grain of suspicion, but you got to do your due diligence and say like, is this person for real in the way that they're saying something? And have somebody that has your back so that you're not stuck in a place that catches you off guard. Do you know what I mean? And on the other end of it, you don't want to be the person that speaks like pretty words to somebody and then just leaves them hanging once you've got them. Like, that's the place where you're supposed to speak like more beautiful words to them, not less beautiful words. Do you get what I'm saying? So ornamentation in words. The seventh thing that he says is the seventh harm is obscene and verbal abuse. So now we're going to get into like things that people would say like, okay, like that makes sense, right? These talks are prohibited. Some of these talks are impurities, Imam Ghazali says. The Prophet said, give up obscene talk, as God does not love obscene and excessive talks. The Prophet prohibited to rebuke the unbelievers who were killed in the Battle of Badr. He said, don't rebuke those dead unbelievers, as these do not reach them, but give trouble to those who are alive. Beware, bad talks are objects that are barred. He said, those who are prone to backbiting, excessive cursing, obscene and excessive talks are not true believers, right? May Allah make us always from the truest of believers. He said, 4 persons will give trouble to the inmates of hell. They will be running between hot water and fire and proclaim their sorrows. One of them will be such from whose mouth pus and blood will come out. He will be asked, why is this condition of yours? He will say, I used to hold obscene and evil talks and take pleasure therein like that of cohabitation, or for that I'm getting this punishment. The Prophet said to Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, O Aisha, if obscene talk could have taken the figure of a man, its figure would have been ugly. He said to hold obscene talk and to make narration are 2 branches of hypocrisy. Narration means to disclose secret talks, which is unlawful. It means also to make excess in narration and to make ornamentation, adding false things. The Prophet said obscene talk or unnecessary talk does not appertain to Islam. He who is best of all in character and conduct is best of all in Islam. Ahnaf ibn Qais rahimahullah said, shall I not inform you of a dangerous disease, bad conduct, and an obscene tongue? So like what makes something obscene? And in understanding that from the standpoint of like our religious tradition, an obscenity and how this relates to like verbalized abuse, like, do you see the connection between these 2 things? Do you know? That's not beautiful speech to verbally abuse someone. Do you know? It's obscene, like it's horrendous. Maulana Rumi rahimahullah, he says, raise your words, not your voices. It's the rain that makes the flowers grow, not thunder. Do you know? So obscenities, like vulgarities, things that just fundamentally we shouldn't be like talking about or speaking about, right? It's obscene that you can walk down the street of New York and you're not being judgmental, but you see it. How many times do you see like men look at women in ways that women do not want them to be looking at them? How many conversations do you get privy to in the ways like those same men are talking about that woman and what they think about like her body and its curvatures and all this other kind of stuff? Just like how is it that people speak about like homeless people or people who are poor or people who have certain racial background, right? It's obscene, like it's disgusting. Do you know? And then this idea of where verbal abuse gets attached to it, right? This is a form of abuse. Physical abuse, we can understand categorically haram. لم يضرب رسول الله امرأة ولا غلاما ولا ولدا قط. That the messenger of God never struck a woman or a servant or a child ever. That's just there. But also in the frame of like verbalized abuses, words have very deep impact. And the obscenity of it is that you are doing wrong by the nature for what you were created when you are verbally abusing somebody who is meant to be someone who your words are like protectors of, not hurting them. Do you know? So how do I know like I'm doing this? You just reflect backwards in your day. Like it doesn't matter if that's your best friend that you're talking about. You're like, oh man, like did you see that? This and that. Like it's obscene. That's not why we were made to express. The 8th he mentions is cursing. He says, another evil of the tongue is to curse anything, be it an animal or a man or a lifeless thing. It is condemned. You don't curse anything. The Prophet said, a believer does not curse another. He said, don't curse another with the curse of God, with his anger or hell. Hudayfa said, The curse of one on another among the people falls on the people. Once one of the Ansari women was passing riding on a camel by the side of the Prophet and cursed the camel. The Prophet then said, "Take down the load from the camel and drive it out of the party as it is cursed." Does it make sense? Like the person cursed the camel and the Prophet made them get rid of it because he said it has literally been cursed, meaning it will diminish the barakah and blessing of like their group now. Do you know? He said, "I am as if looking towards the camel which was walking to end from among the people. Nobody approached it." Abu Darda radiallahu anh said, "If anybody curses a land, it says, 'Curse of God be upon the person who is the greatest sinner amongst us.'" Abu Bakr was cursing one of his maidservants. The Prophet heard it and said, "O Abu Bakr, a man of truth and a curser are together?" as a question. "It can never occur by the Lord of the Kaaba." He repeated it twice or thrice. Then Abu Bakr emancipated someone in response to this. He came to the Prophet and said, "I will do it no more." And the Prophet said, "The cursors will not be intercessors or witnesses on the resurrection day." And you understand, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, like the goal is not to romanticize the companions, but when he slipped up, he acknowledged it, tried to follow a bad with a good, and then made a commitment, this ain't coming for me ever again. You see? And that's the determination point, right? So language and expressions of language are things that literally have capacity to curse in our tradition. Does that make sense? So like you said, somebody go to hell, like what are you really saying at that juncture? If you like damn something, like what are you meaning in that kind of damnation? Do you know? Does that make sense? And then he goes into a section where he talks about if you were to curse something, then it has to be the things that the Sharia allows for you to curse. Things like oppression, things like infidelity, things along these lines that are permittable things to curse. Okay, why don't we do this? Because I've been talking for a bit and I don't want us to go on a marathon. If we can turn to the persons next to us, what are you taking away from tonight's conversation so far? We went to 8 of these things, and we're going to go through the balance of them the next time that we meet. But let's take a quick pause and turn to the people next to us. Like, what are we kind of taking away from this so far? In the prism of what we've discussed, we spent like a few weeks talking about what is khair and like the iman element to this, man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir, right? And now we want to understand this not as a laundry list that we just repeat and regurgitate, but it comes back into some frame of like my own existence. And if I am speaking shar, then I'm not speaking khair, do you know? So how do I like kind of build into my own reflective mode that these are things that have capacity to do? So I want to start to limit those things in some way. But let's talk about some of the things we're taking away. We'll make a couple of announcements and then we'll wrap up for today. Go ahead.
Yeah.
But the point is there is purpose to limiting. If you really want to establish people, they might not find it all.
Maybe much to see
I did also like the text.
I feel like that, yeah, that point was really, and I try to like, practice myself as the facade. That part.
Yeah. For me, like when I work, I appreciate simplicity.
Yeah.
The pressure. This is what. Exactly. Yes. Like I'm happy that it's stopping good.
That's why
I mean, everyone's on like I try not to cross.
yeah.
But I feel like the first few days, I'm hyper aware of how casually it comes out. You gotta ask, there's like a way to.
That's a street.
I don't know. It should be awesome.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I was thinking about how
What if someone I guess it just shows the importance of
Okay, what are some of the things we're taking away from today? What's coming up for people? We can get a few people, and then we'll take a pause and pray Isha. Yeah.
Discussing with the sisters, essentially, your tongue is a mirror of your heart. So it's important that what you speak and what you put out there is of good. Because if not, you're going to constantly put those bad thoughts in your heart. Kind of what I interpret it as everything that you want to break.
Yeah. And just think how much of your day is spent communicating, you know? And the goal is not to just go hide in a cave and not talk to anybody, but the idea is to kind of, you know, enhance and refine like my mode of interaction with people. Do you see what I mean? And the prism of it being exactly what this is, the consequence back to me is that it impacts my heart. You know, it's coming back and it creates like this cloak around my heart, right? And envelops it. And then it just perpetuates more and more. You see? What else? What else do we discuss?
I have a question. So when you were describing the interaction between the woman and the camel, and like what I understood from that was that like this woman cursed the camel, and then they were like, "Oh, we have to get rid of the camel, right? Because it's cursed now." So I wanted to know like why is like if that woman is like not a nice person, and then she cursed the camel, like why is it the camel's fault? And the reason why I ask is because normally like in South Asian cultures, it's really common for people to just like when they're mad at each other to be like they say things that are basically a curse. Like, I hope this happens to you, like, for the rest of your life. So then it's like, what if in that situation there's like a bad person and a good person, and that person didn't do anything wrong to deserve the curse being like thrown at them?
Well, you can seek protections from curses, right? So, like knowing what our tradition offers to us, the recitation of like Ayatul Kursi, the last two verses, Surah Baqarah in its entirety, the Quls, like these are protections from different things. Do you know? But fundamentally, like you know, if I walk down the street and somebody decides to throw a shoe at my face, like I didn't have to do anything for it to hurt me. Do you know what I mean? Like Allah witnesses it, and when we stand in front of Allah, like Allah in His infinite wisdom and judgment is going to determine accountability in that regard. But somebody doesn't need my permission to like hurt me. Do you understand? And it doesn't always end up being in a place where like mindfulness is the requirement for some of these things. Like, you know, we're taught of individuals who speak in the cradle as infants, right? Does that make sense? Like they're babies and they talk, you know, like Jesus, peace be upon him, talks as a baby, do you know? So there's a person that we're talking about whose name is Jurayj, and Jurayj was just like a very pious individual, and he prayed a lot. And one time he was in prayer and his mother was calling him and he did not respond to his mother's call. And his mother essentially like says, let him not die without seeing the face of a prostitute, you know, in her anger. And so some time later, a prostitute in the community is impregnated by a man. And the man says, like when your baby is born, tell them Jurayj is the father, not me. And this woman does this. Jurayj, you know, is then kind of taken away and explained like this woman said, you are the father of her child, and this is who she is, and whatever. And Jurayj like smiles because he knows it's the words of his mother's like prayer, like manifesting. And one of the instances where a child speaks out in infancy is this child that says, Jurayj is not my father is this person. Do you see? So you want to like take our tradition seriously that says like after every prayer you recite the Ayatul Kursi, and before you go to bed like you recite the Ayatul Kursi and the last verses of Surah Baqarah and the Quls as protections from things. Do you know? And also then recognize like you only control the presence of yourself. And this is the exact point, right? If South Asian culture allows for it, that means South Asian culture is wrong here. And our religion teaches us to embrace every culture because religion necessarily needs culture to exist. It can't exist in a vacuum. So Islam in China looks Chinese, and Islam in India looks Indian, and Islam in Sudan looks Sudanese, right? But cultures also have bad things. And this is a terrible thing. And just because it becomes the norm doesn't mean that that's what makes it acceptable. Like, it's a problematic thing to be cursing people, do you know? And it hurts. I mean, can you imagine? Say we got into a fight. I got Allah protect me from ever doing this to any of you. But say I got angry with one of you, do you know? I can't believe you left your chair in the middle of the prayer room. And you're like, I'm so sorry. I'm like, no, it's unacceptable. Just go to hell, right? And you're like, what is going on? You can already feel within yourself like the impact like of the words, right? How can you follow this religion and then not think of like metaphysical impacts also? Do you see what I mean? Like, it's going to hurt your heart that somebody says that in those ways. Like, it's like, how is it hurting you if not for like your inner self, right? And what you want to adopt is a mindset that says, I know who my teacher is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do you know what I mean? Somebody's going to come at me. May Allah protect all of you from ever being recipient of any kind of hostilities or aggressions, and protect you from ever also like engaging in those things, right? But like, yeah, these are realities, do you know? And it's not that it's the camel's fault as such, but just in recognizing like where the Prophet is the best of teachers and he understands the implications on a whole, like this woman did this thing and now this thing like bears impact. The Prophet is not like a cruel human being. It's a camel. Camels like live in the desert. They're very like kind of what's the word that I'm thinking of? You know, they're very resilient creatures in terms of how they store water and whatever else. But you also think about it from the standpoint of compassion. The Prophet is not just separating the camel from the group. The Prophet is separating the camel from the woman who cursed him. Do you see? And this woman did not honor the rights of this camel. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? But language is very important, right? And like, you have to be mindful. Your words could become du'as in ways that like the consequences of those things are very real. Does that make sense? Yeah. And that's why like speak good or be silent is very important. Do you see what I mean? Right? And it's one of the foundational hadith on ethics in our religion. So just really quickly, in understanding like what the rest of this list looks like, after these first 8, he's going to talk about song and poetry. He's not saying music is haram, but he's going to make a categorical difference between like indecent and unlawful poetry and good and lawful poetry. He's going to talk about laughter and joking, right? There's hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he tells us to smile. It's a sadaqah. There's also hadith where he says, وَلَا تُكَثِّرَ الدَّهْكِ فَإِنَّ كَثْرَةَ الدَّهْكِ تُمِيتُ الْقَلْبَ, that do not laugh in excess, because indeed in excess of laughter it weakens the heart, right? So the 9th thing, song and poetry. The 10th things, laughter and jokes. 11, he's going to talk about ridiculing. 12, like disclosing secrets. 13, false promises. 14, lying and giving false oath. 15, backbiting. 16, hypocrisy. 17, tale-bearing, what we call namima, and slander. 18, praise. So he's going to talk about how praise can be a problematic thing. Not always, but situationally. 19, he's going to talk about carelessness or like inattentiveness in our words. And 20, he's going to talk about questions of ordinary men about God and like who God is and God's attributes and these kinds of things, right? There'll be a couple of other things that we could talk about that are important, right? Like when you talk about religion, you want to make sure you know what you're talking about. Do you know? People throw all kinds of stuff at me when I was growing up. Some guy told me eating baked ziti is haram. Do you know? And I was like, well, how is eating baked ziti haram? Do you know? But what he was trying to say was like, hey, we're like desi. Why are you eating baked ziti? Eat some biryani. Do you know? But like he said, baked ziti is haram. And I'm a kid. And I'm like, am I eating like haram right now? Do you know? But he's making a claim religiously that's problematic. That's like a religious statement to make, right? Like if somebody says to you, Allah will punish you for what you're doing, how do they know? right? Just like they'll say Allah will reward you for what you're doing. The Prophet Ibrahim is Khalil Allah. He made dua all the time, Rabbana taqabbal minna, right? That oh, Allah accept from me, because you don't know. Like Allah is the one that's going to accept. How do you know? Just do what you got the ability to do, and then ask God to accept it. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? But it's in God's determination what he accepts and what he rejects. Do you see what I mean? But these are the things that like we want to delve into a little bit more. What you want to do is just think about them reflectively, right? We talked about khair a lot because the idea is to not just avoid what's bad, but to do what's good. You know, speak words of upliftment and kindness and whatever else. Just like you break down any other habit, it's going to be hard. You know, I'm going to have to confront the reality that a lot of my friendships are based off of some of these things. And like if I like have to stop hanging out with people, I'm gonna have a lot of time to like kill. Do you know what I mean? Or like to go to the other extreme, that's like I don't have to cut it out, right? Like what do I do with family members who do X, Y, or Z? Just step number one is introspective, do you know? And you come up with strategies and plans that are rooted in realities. And then we can help like create those strategies and plans. You don't have to figure it out together, but we want to diminish like what is shar. And who could sit here and tell us that any of these things like doesn't make sense, that it's a problem, but the potential is there, right? Have you ever made a joke at somebody else's expense? Do you know? And like you know that person's hurt. Then did you go and say sorry, or did you make them feel like they were a loser because they couldn't take a joke? Do you know what I mean? It's just a joke. Why don't you just deal with it? You hurt somebody's feelings, just apologize. You have a prophet who is sinless and he sought forgiveness 70 times a day, right? You're going to definitely like hurt people. That's an indication of that you actually have like love there. They care about what you have to say. Do you know what I mean? There's something that is meaningful that these words impact me. Do you know? Right? Okay, so we'll go through some of these next time. Just a couple of quick things before we pause and pray Isha. Our drive is still happening for women and children who are in shelters. Alhamdulillah, we were able to fill up the list for one of the shelters fully, which is great. Alhamdulillah. And there's the second shelter now that needs its attention. The issues and errors that were on the shelter's lists have been remedied. So normally we would make the lists here and collect the goods here and package them. This year, they opted to have the goods sent directly to the shelter, and they made the list themselves. So there was some errors functionally in kind of addresses and delivery options and whatever else. So that second list is still there and has been updated. If we can fill that up, it's going to go till February 10th. Yusra is in the back and she has a QR code, and we'll share it and spread it around as well. But if we can get that second list finalized also, that would be great. Did you want to say something?
Today's the 10th.
Is today the 10th? Oh, no way. Is today the last day? Yeah, so today's the last day. It's 8:30. You just like mobilize people. I'll give you an example. In Ramadan, somebody asked us if we could help raise funds to provide suhoor and iftar to the migrants. And they needed to raise like $300,000 for the entire month. I made one announcement at Tarawih that night. We sent out an email, and in 12 hours, we raised more than $300,000. Alhamdulillah, right? So you have a capacity in 3.5 hours to really share this with like WhatsApp groups that you're in and people that you know, and you could do a lot of really good stuff in 3.5 hours. You just gotta want to like push yourself to get to that place. And the consequence is gonna be what? Like not directly to us in the sense of like what is physical, but metaphysically, you don't benefit from the good you don't do. And nobody benefits from the good you don't do. So at the receiving end, there's going to be these women and children in these shelters. They're not going to get the basic goods that they need because we didn't get it for them. Do you see what I mean? So I think this iPad is getting passed around. Do we have it somewhere? Yeah, great. And we'll leave it over here, and you can talk to Yusra after we pray Isha also, just so we get that going. Next Monday, the building is closed. So we won't be meeting next Monday. There's also a chance if you come to my Wednesday halakha, not this week, but next week, that we won't be meeting next Wednesday for that. But I'll let people know before the end of the week, and it'll be in the email list. But because the university is closed on Monday for President's Day, our building is closed also. So we'll meet 2 Mondays from now. And then when Ramadan starts, right, may Allah bless us to reach it and take benefit from it. I teach some classes in our public policy school on Mondays. And with the time shifting for Maghrib and then daylight savings time, I'm probably not going to get out of class in time. I get out of class at 6:10 to do the pre-iftar halakas. So there's a good chance I'm going to do Tuesdays and Fridays and not Mondays and Fridays. We don't typically continue with the text through Ramadan, but maybe we will. I don't know. But just so people can kind of anticipate that, because of my teaching schedule for the semester, I'm not going to be able to get out of class in time for when we start the pre-iftar halakha, and where Maghrib kind of lies in between some of it. But if we don't do this in Ramadan, we'll just pick up the Monday after Ramadan, inshallah, and then continue through the summer, like we did last year. Are there any other events and programs that are happening that we want to announce to people? So everything the rest of this week is going to stay the same.
There's a convert station potluck on Saturday.
Is that true, Sola? You don't want people? Is it at his house? Is that your house?
Location TBD. We're looking according to like the RSVP.
Oh yeah.
The number and then send out like an email. So if anyone is gonna RSVP, there's no location, but later in the week we'll send a confirmation.
Okay, mashallah. So if you're somebody who's exploring Islam as a non-Muslim, not somebody who's exploring Islam who's born into Islam, but you're exploring Islam as somebody who's not Muslim, you're a convert to Islam, so somebody who was not Muslim and then became Muslim, or you're like a family member, a partner, somebody of those two groupings, the brunch is open and extended as an invite to you. If you know people who fit into any of those groups, feel free to let Solo know, after we pray Isha, and he can give you details on how to sign up for the brunch itself. Great. So let's take a pause here. I'm sorry if I was a little out of it today. I just had a very long day and some meetings that were not enjoyable during the course of the day. So forgive me if the vibe in the room was a little lower and we were just kind of reading through a list instead of really kind of digging deep into it. But let's put the chairs back and we'll make Isha in a few minutes, inshallah, and then we'll see everybody in a couple of weeks. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.